So I think Matt has segment 1 in our regular episode, correct?
He does. He's up with Joy Division.
He's going to do our second Joy Division. So Matt, why don't you go ahead and tell us what was in the montage and what you're going to open the segment with?
Okay, so we got Joy Division's Closer. In the opening montage, you heard a clip from Isolation, and now you're going to hear a clip from Decades. All right, so Joy Division's Closer comes in at number 9 in the 1980s on Best Ever Albums, cracking the top 10. Number 2 in 1980 and number 75 of all time. It is Joy Division's second highest rated album on Best Ever Albums, behind Unknown Pleasures, which we covered just a couple weeks ago. That was the final episode of the 70s, if I'm not mistaken.
Correct.
And this album also made Rolling Stone's list, coming in at number 309. It is, as Josh mentioned earlier, Joy Division's second and final album, which was recorded in March of 1980 at Britannia Row Studios in London, which, if you guys remember, this is Pink Floyd's studio, so they're returning back there. The album was released on July 18th, 1980, and these songs were written mostly over 2 periods, having one set of songs, which were the more guitar-driven songs, including Atrocity Exhibition, Passover, Colony, A Means to an End, and 24 Hours, were written in the latter part of 1979 and were tried out during the live performances that they had at that time, whereas the more synth-driven songs, Isolation, Heart and Soul, The Eternal, and Decades, were written during jam sessions in the early 1980s. Producer Martin Hannett returns to produce this album, and the band, particularly Peter Hook on bass and Bernard Sumner on guitar and synths, had the same reactions to the producer Martin Hannett as they did with Unknown Pleasures. Hook wrote in his memoir, "I was like head in hands. Oh fucking hell, it's happening again. Martin had fucking melted the guitar with his Marshall time waster, made it sound like someone strangling a cat, and to my mind, absolutely killed the song. I was so annoyed with him and went in and gave him a piece of my mind, but he just turned around and told me to fuck off." So again, like,
it's kind of like our production meetings,
pretty much. The band, again, really, particularly Peter Hook, wanted to replicate the live shows, which were much more guitar-driven and they were loud. That was, Hook was trying to, come off as more of a rock-oriented band, where Martin Hannett would kind of make the production more subdued, more stripped down, more synth, and so guys didn't like it. But then later on, Peter Hook realizes again that this is the way that it probably should have gone, and he realizes the brilliance of the production. He said in another quote, "I wanted to rip people's heads off with my guitar, and I was absolutely wrong. Thankfully, Martin Hannett recognized the maturity of our songwriting and the strengths in our songs he felt needed playing down, making it more seductive." So, and it's interesting because watching that movie, Josh, you can you hear the difference, because they are, playing live. They're a much louder band. It's much more rock oriented. So it's kind of like a different band altogether. So that was another takeaway from that documentary. I kind of saw where Sumner and Hook were coming from, as being like, that doesn't sound like us. That's not the way we wanted it to be. But so again, Martin Hannett, you have to give him credit here for really creating the Joy Division sound. So there was some touring that the band was doing in Europe in early 1980. Lead singer Ian Curtis had suffered several seizures during the tour, including 2 grand mal seizures, and sometimes this would lead to them canceling a performance. the audience actually sometimes thought that it was part of the show, and you can kind of see that with his dancing. He's kind of got like I kind of almost see like he had to be an influence on Tom York, just seeing the way that he was dancing. And if you ever see Tom York from Radiohead dance, it's like a convulsive kind of, spaz attack that they're having, and it's very similar to that. So, and you could see how people would confuse actual seizures with what he's doing, because his dancing is actually very much like he's having a seizure. At this time, Ian Curtis was also having marital issues with his wife, Deborah, and he was also involved in an affair with a Belgian journalist and music producer by the name of Aniek Hanor, and she was in that featured in that documentary that Josh had watched earlier as well. April 7th, 1980, actually Ian Curtis does attempt suicide for the first time by overdosing on his seizure medication. This leads to the cancellation of several shows. They did find they got a couple of people to replace him at the last minute to do to sing, but that didn't really go over too well. And the band actually played their final gig on May 2nd at the University of Birmingham. Fun fact, May 2nd, 1980, that's the day my sister was born. So I mentioned that to her. I was like, hey, do you know that you were born on the day of the last Joy Division performance? And she never responded to my text. So I don't think she knows who Joy Division is.
Very typical, I'm sure.
Very typical, yeah. So they were scheduled to go on tour in the U.S. For the first time, and Curtis was nervous about how the American audiences would react to him and his potential seizures on stage. He had a fear of flying. He actually toyed with the idea of traveling across the Atlantic by sea. And on the night before they were supposed to leave, he actually goes home to speak to his wife. This is on May 18th, 1980. She had filed for divorce, and he was trying to talk her out of it. So they talk a little bit about that. He asks her to leave, and by the time she comes back the next day, she found him hanging. So he hung himself at the age of 23, which is ridiculously young. So the band decides, that they're not going to continue as Joy Division, and shortly after Ian Curtis's death, the three of them go on to form New Order. Within a couple of weeks, they actually start writing songs. So, which seems kind of crazy, but Peter Hook was saying in the documentary, that it was just we didn't know what else to do, right? Like
right.
we were young and we were dumb, and I think Peter Hook didn't even go to Ian Curtis's funeral.
Mm-hmm.
He said that he regretted that very much later on, but he was like, I was a dumb kid and I didn't know what I was doing, essentially. So they released the single Love Will Tear Us Apart in June of that year, which hit number 13 on the UK singles chart. I was surprised that wasn't on this record. I thought it was going to be, but it just turns out that it was a single. Yeah. And in July of 1980, Closer was released. So a couple months after Ian Curtis's death, it did peak at number 6 on the UK charts and was met with universal acclaim. Many people considering it to be superior to Unknown Pleasures. I actually saw a lot of back and forth on that. Some people feel this is better. Some people feel Unknown Pleasures is better. But generally speaking, the critics are universally approve of Joy Division. And I'm interested to hear the takes on that. So we'll start with John. What were your takes on Closer?
Yeah, this is a very cold album. Like it's definitely, when you talk about the term industrial, I would say that's what this album is. I found it at times impenetrable for me. It's the songs are. I heard it described this way after kind of looking for context of what I was going for. They said there's a lot of dirge-like quality to this, and that's a great way to describe it, I think, because it is sort of a collection of dirges. I divide this album into two different categories. One is the production, which I think is very seductive. It's appealing because it's cold, but it's cold. You can't get in necessarily, but you have to pay attention to it, I guess would be the best way I'd describe it. It's the type of production that grabs my attention, even if it's not grabbing me with a necessarily a comfortable entree in. Outside of that, there's a ton of piano on this album, a ton of piano. that synthesize it. The bass line sort of hook. I described in Unknown Pleasures, I said the guitar sort of weaves in and out of the songs. It does that a little bit less here. There's a more of a constancy to the guitar in this album, I would say. I like the second half of this album considerably more than I like the first half of this album. I kind of found the first half of the album with Atrocity Exhibition and Isolation right off the bat, it really sets a tone, doesn't it? Like yes. it's a bleak, and I know that sort of the knock is that it's hard to disconnect Joy Division from the suicide of Ian Curtis. Mm-hmm. And I was able to in Unknown Pleasures. I didn't really go there. I listened to it more as its own album and sort of was able to detach it. This was harder, both lyrical content wise, but also the sound of the album and the overall. There was a lyrical theme, but there was also I felt a sonic theme of but like a chaotic depression, I would say, or isolation. Almost like your life is sort of leaving you, like it's leaving your body kind of, and it sounds like that. And I've made the joke often that like Alice in Chains' Dirt, right, is what it sounds like to do heroin and be depressed. You know, that's kind of like, you, even if you haven't done it, you like can get a feel. It's like, ooh, that's bleak, and you can feel it, right? This album almost feels to me like what it was like to be Ian Curtis, right, with the loss of control of his physical end of things, depression, just like, and this was like the score for that to some degree. But with it, like, then there's these oddly catchy musical parts that sort of bring you, that you're able to disconnect from that narrative at times, you know, either guitar parts or piano or bass lines that draw you out of it. And just when you're going back in, though, there's the bleakness of the overall theme that it's unrelenting, right? It doesn't let you climb from it, even if you want to. And I think that's almost kind of like what this was designed. And I even think when you look at the name of the album, Closer, I think it keeps drawing you closer, right? But the question is, like, do you want to be drawn closer into this? Because you kind of know both what they're trying to get to you and also what the postscript is, right? For, unfortunately, one of the members of it. So I connected considerably more with Unknown Pleasures. There was an element that brought me in and kind of fascinated me about this album. I wouldn't say I was fascinated by this album, but I was certainly never bored, right? There was just a chaos to this album, but also, along with the chaos, a constancy of theme that was a real juxtaposition on this album, which I think is part of what, if Joy Division is speaking to you, is part of what makes you speak out. It's also a very washed out sound, this album. Like you know that drowned, washed out sound? Mm-hmm. Does that make sense production wise?
Yeah.
And you even mentioned it, Matt, in the bio, that like he felt like the production swallowed up the guitars again. And that's a little bit of what I would call the washed out production sound. So those are my initial thoughts. I'd love to expand on them, but I'm curious to see what you guys thought.
Yeah, I was kind of lukewarm on the first album. This album, for me, it's hard to not separate Ian Curtis, especially Ian Curtis' suicide from this album. I feel like it's right there on the page lyrically and sound wise, and the fact that he was, you know, the primary songwriter it just kind of makes it more apparent. It's definitely a dark album. It seems like there's a struggle there. I paid attention to the lyrics a lot on one listen, at least one listen, and you know, there's a lot of religious references. Spiritual kind of the struggle, kind of even the look of the cover is religious in some sort of fashion, and even some of the titles, right, like Isolation and Passover and the Eternal. Those can be construed as, you know, religious, you know, descriptors, and I responded to the synth aspect of the album a lot more than the rest of it. Isolation's probably my favorite song on the album, just kind of due to the synth aspect of it, and it's also kind of the most New Order sounding of the songs. You can almost hear kind of the proto transition that they would make to that sound. There's a trance-like quality to this album that is hard to which I understand how people could be into, but I kind of get lost in it in some aspects, and it all kind of ends up, there's nothing that I can grasp onto as a result. The talent is there for sure, and I think he was a good writer. I think the lyrics, I said all the stuff about the lyrics. I think his lyrics are complex, and he has an insight or a point of view that he is bringing to the lyrics that we haven't seen in a lot of bands in this kind of at all, really. Especially kind of this religious struggle point of view. And so I will give them credit for that, but there's just something about this band that keeps me at arm's length, and I can't totally get into. They're like almost, it's that cold quality again, and it's also the maybe the stuff with the depression and things. I just can't. I don't feel the kind of dance-like quality that you guys feel, or that you brought up in the first album. I don't hear it here as much. I don't see.
I don't either in this album. Not as much. Yeah.
I don't see an appeal to, hearing them live would not make me. It would just make me depressed. It wouldn't make me like feel there's not some sort of group energy or something that I feel like that would come from listening to this album or seeing them perform this live. So I mean, from Joy Division springs New Order, and I'm not too familiar with them other than the big hits. So I guess we'll see how that, without Ian Curtis, what they sound like and what they kind of evolve to. But it's such an interesting like two album history of a band, kind of short but unique, and left their mark, and I appreciate it on that level. But emotionally and as an album that I would revisit, I don't think I would connect with it or revisit again.
Well, it's definitely cold, and it's definitely depressing, and I love it. I think this is really starting to get into that. I was definitely thinking of Radiohead listening to that in terms of kind of some of the sounds that they're going for, and some of the beats too, because you've got a song like Colony and Passover. Passover actually sounds like a Can song. That's got that guitar part and the beat behind it's very much of like a krautrock Can type thing, which also reminds me of Radiohead as well. But there's something about it is off-putting and cold, but I am somewhat drawn in by that at the same time. I think it's the music like this is oddly appealing to me as a relatively happy person.
Right.
And again, the lyrics are definitely like Isolation's got some brutal lyrics, being I'm ashamed of who I am, and and things like that. But again, that takes a back seat to what I'm hearing sonically, which is I do the combination of the kind of the more rock oriented guitar stuff along with the synth stuff. I don't know if I don't know if I have a side of this album that I like better than the other. I think probably Atrocity Exhibition. That's a really interesting way to open the record. It might be my least favorite song on this. I think it might be have the least melody to it compared to everything else, or just that one's a little bit harder to get into. But then you go to Isolation, Passover, and Colony. Really like those three songs. Colony's got this really interesting offbeat kind of drumming going on. That's I don't know what the time signature is in there, but it's definitely not typical. And the electronic stuff toward the last two songs are killer at the end of this song. I mean, they're so sad and depressing, but they sound so good. It's just like this. It's hard to describe why I find that so captivating, but it's just I don't mind being drawn. Would you say it was like kind of hypnotic, Josh? I forget the word.
Trance-like, I said.
Like a trance-like thing. I like it when music does that sometimes. If it's something that I can kind of get into and it kind of drags on a little bit, but it's also just a really appealing sound, which those two songs definitely have, Eternal and Decades. Then I'm going to. I'm fine listening to that for a while, right? And those are two songs that go at 6 minutes long. So yeah, this is definitely hitting in my wheelhouse and the things that I like. And I've mentioned Radiohead before, but I definitely think that had to be an influence on Tom York. I mean, not and when I saw Ian Curtis dancing like that in the documentary, I was like, geez, there's definitely elements that they're picking up on here and that melancholy kind of sound. But it's not terribly off-putting for me. I kind of like that stuff. I find it more interesting, even though I'm kind of a pop-oriented guy that really likes melody and likes being upbeat. But I like this stuff too. I can't say which one I like, but I maybe like Unknown Pleasures better, but this was still pretty strong for me. And there's the more I listen, I liked it. I never really got sick of it. I listened to this album a lot, along with the other two records this week, because we've been putting them off for 2 weeks in a row, and I'm just like, let me listen to Judas Priest again. So yeah, I'm a big thumbs up on this. I'm glad we're covering them. I'm interested to see where New Order goes. Like you, Josh, I know the singles and some of their stuff, but I'm not terribly familiar with them. But I'm just, again, hearing a lot of stuff that's coming up later on in the 80s and 90s in indie rock and and a lot of the artists and musicians that I like, even up into the 2000s, really. So these guys are definitely trailblazers. And they shone bright. I think these two records very influential, and I'm a fan of. So I'm thumbs up on this.
Shone bright until they collapsed into a black hole.
Yeah, that was a flash. It was a flash.
Yeah, it's interesting that the Radiohead connection I didn't think of before, but I guess they do have aspects. I need to listen to Radiohead probably more, but
yeah, but it's not all over the place, but it's definitely in here. I felt.
I don't get a huge Radiohead. I mean, obviously there's elements of, like you said, Tom York's stage presence, the sort of the convulsive elements of that, I think, and the passion that's there. But Ian Curtis's voice is that baritone voice that's very there. Somebody mentioned once there aren't a lot of baritones that sing, right, in rock music. When you think about it, there really aren't. When you start thinking about what the baritone voice sounds like, there aren't a lot of people with that voice, and as a result, his voice, while not singular, is close to singular for me. So he sort of colors the album in a way that Tom York does a very different, you know what I mean? He goes higher in the register for most of his career. Maybe not on like Pablo Honey, but like
his
the
voice
rest of
adds even more weight to like the lyrics and stuff.
Well, it adds like an edginess to it, but it's an edgy, like a nervous energy at times, like a spastic energy, where this is sort of more of like I said, a dirge kind of. It hits you over the head relentlessly, consistently, over and over again, as opposed to just taking you up and down peaks. And I think that's the difference for me. I also think that musically, Radiohead is always trying to do different time signatures and changes and stuff like that. And this is a lot more like Matt, the krautrock type stuff. And at times there is a metronomic quality to what they're trying to do. That's what the synth, in its own right, provides that element. So.
But it's the voice is definitely different for sure. But songs particularly like Passover and Colony, I hear Radiohead stuff in there.
I know what you're saying.
Not slathered all over the place, but it's definitely there. And you did talking about Ian Curtis's voice did remind me. I mean, this is I think Josh, you mentioned this the first time we covered them. I think it was you, but yeah, Jim Morrison. He's got like that Jim Morrison that baritone kind of voice. And I don't know if Ian Curtis. I didn't see anything where he was influenced by Jim Morrison, but gosh, it sounds like he's trying to pop a Jim Morrison type vocal,
Right. Yeah, I mean, Atrocity Exhibition is very Doorsy. So is Isolation, actually, in many ways. Yeah, right off the bat, and it does give that vibe.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, but Ian Curtis doesn't bring the kind of same range, maybe intentionally, that Morrison does.
He doesn't. He never brings it up high.
Morrison's more emotional and more expressive, maybe.
But in terms of just like the like you said.
Well,
like
he has
baritone.
A presence, though. Yeah, well, that's like a husky baritone kind of. You know what I mean? But like Ian Curtis doesn't go into like like that type element, whereas he stays much more. Yeah. And I also think that Ian Curtis is trying to get you to connect emotionally, but in a way to understand him, whereas Jim Morrison's just throwing it out there, and it's like if you connect, you connect, and if you don't, the energy in the world is just too raw, whereas I think I get like a desperation in Ian Curtis that I don't get from Jim Morrison, if that makes sense. Like, there's a lot of things you say about Jim Morrison, but like desperation, is not necessarily something I get from him. Yeah.
Yeah, I agree. Yeah, you can feel the struggle and the pain in the Ian Curtis. I mean, maybe I'm reading too much into that because of what we know, but I feel like it's there.
I think in all of them, though, not just him. I think they're all sort of that Manchester. There's a bleakness. Remember what Black Sabbath said about their hometown, right? It was kind of like, fuck, our music is a manifestation of like where we're from, right? I feel like to some degree this cold, isolated, that there's a reason they call it industrial, right? The sound that we're identifying, and it's because it's like being an industrial town.
Yep. Yeah, I don't know. Peter Hook always seemed kind of like the frat boy kind of member of the band. There was one part where they recording this record, they rented out a couple of flats next to each other, and so you had Peter Hook was kind of in like the party flat, and so he would constantly like pull pranks on like Ian Curtis and Bernard Sumner and stuff, and he seemed to be a little bit more full of life in that regard than the other guys, and I think that's probably one of the reasons why that over time he and Sumner had a big falling out, and now they pretty much hate each other, like really hate each other. But it's there. Ian Curtis is it's amazing how someone so young, like I just can't have like 23. He had a wife, a kid, and it's amazing how much pain he was at such a young age, and it's just super very very sad.
Knowing his story too, like she's lost control. Like knowing the seizure story, right? It really gives added heft to that story because he's kind of writing about himself in the context of somebody else. It's kind of eerie, actually. Yeah.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. He was like so worried. He had a kid at this point, and he was, because of his seizures, he was terrified to even hold his child because he was afraid he would seize up and harm the kid and stuff like that. So, it was very sad to say the least. So.